My name is Mackenzie Lyon. I am the Vice President of External Affairs for Perpetua Resources. And thank you for joining us today. We are hosting today's conversation in order to enhance discussions around a topic that we all care about, the health of our rivers. So today, we're going to cover the current conditions of the East Fork, South Fork, Salmon River, and our proposal to help address the legacies that were left behind decades ago. And today, we are lucky enough to be joined by some of our most talented experts on the team on matters of river restoration, fish habitat, and water quality. And we're going to do our best to keep this presentation under an hour, but we do have a lot of content to go through. And we'll absolutely make time for a QA session afterwards. But again, if you have a question as we go, please feel free to use that Q&A box. So for those of you who haven't been so lucky to travel to Stibnite, from where I am in Boise, I would go from Boise to the town of Cascade on Highway 55, and then up Warm Lake Road, and either down South Fork Road or Johnson Creek Road till the town of Yellow Pine. From there, it's about a 14-mile journey to Stibnite. One thing I would note is that in our proposal, we are not proposing to travel down South Fork or Johnson Creek Road to access the mine. Instead, we've planned a new route that will help connect old logging and mining routes in order to avoid these sensitive areas. And as we start the conversation today, it's important to also get a good sense of what Stibnite is today. So this historical Stibnite mining district first saw mining activity back in 1899, right around the Thunder Mountain Gold Rush. Predominantly at that time, they were looking for gold and silver. But the majority of the mining at Stibnite actually occurred during World War II and just past the Korean War. And this is because here at Stibnite, they identified a really important source of both tungsten and antimony. And these were considered critical for the US war effort. So again, most of the mining happened up here long before there were environmental regulations on how to mine or how to leave the area when they were done. And as a result, there are many legacies that have been left behind. So for example, today, the East Fork, South Fork of the Salmon River flows into the abandoned Yellow Pine mining pit. As a result, this has also blocked CHINOOK, steelhead, and bull trout from migrating into the upper headwaters of the East Fork and MEADOW Creek in order to reach spawning grounds for over 80 years. We also have over 10.5 million tons of unlined tailings and spent ore that currently pose a risk to degrading water quality, both with arsenic and antimony. And then overall, we just have degraded habitat conditions, both from sources of sedimentation, past forest fires, etc. So this is an area that needs help. However, between 2002 and 2012, the former operators and the former governmental entities involved signed a series of 3 circlet decrees. And these decrees allowed these parties to walk away from any future responsibility over the environmental conditions that have been left behind here at Stibnite. So knowing this about Stibnite, we knew that if responsible modern mineral development was going to happen here, it had to bring along environmental solutions. And that's why we've designed this project to repair the legacies of the past, to leave Stibnite better than it is today. And in doing so, also produce the minerals and metals that we need for our country, both gold and the critical mineral antimony. So we spent 6 years gathering data, listening to our communities, and putting together a plan for the Stibnite Gold Project that we call the Plan of Restoration and Operations. That was then delivered to the U.S. Forest Service over 4 years ago, which initiated regulatory review of the project under the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. This regulatory review includes a whole number of local, state, and federal agencies. And it also recently included a 75-day public comment period on the draft environmental impact statement. Now, some of the things that this draft environmental impact statement concluded supported our approach with the project. that by looking to restore the legacy aspects of the site through modern mining, we could increase stream functional units and wetland functional units. We could help support fish populations by providing more access to critical habitat. We can improve water quality, and we can overall help restore components of the site. But it's also important to note that the draft EIS is a draft for a reason. It is intended through the NEPA process to help the public get eyes on a proposal and provide comments and feedback. So through that 75-day comment period, there were just over or under 10,000 comments received. And while the majority of them were supportive of the concept and the project, there still were some that we wanted to pay really close attention to because they did bring forward concepts and ideas that can make the project better. And through that process, in reading the draft EIS and reading the comments, we've been able to now identify opportunities to improve water quality, reduce stream temperature, and overall reduce the footprint of the project. So, for example, we've now proposed to the U.S. Forest Service in response to comments on the draft an overall 10% reduction in total volume of mined material, that we would reduce the size of the Hanger Flats pit by 70% and fully backfill it, and we would also eliminate the need for what we call the fiddle waste rock area. And by doing this, also see a substantial reduction in our overall footprint for the mine. Some of the added benefits that these elements bring are to improve water quality, to overall reduce water temperature back to levels that are more closely aligned with baseline, and reduce our footprint, which were all goals that we went into. And ultimately, this is how the NEPA process is designed to work, to take in feedback and to continually be iterative to ensure that by the end of the day, by the time we get to that final environmental impact statement, we have a project that truly has been refined and is the best for Idaho. So with that overview on where we are, I want to be able to turn it over to Rob to talk about some of the conditions of the site today and how we've approached the project design.
Thanks, Mackenzie. You hear me okay? Great. I'm Rob Richardson. I'm a principal geomorphologist at Rio Applied Science and Engineering. We are a small engineering company here in Boise, Idaho, and we specialize 100% on doing stream restoration and stream restoration design. We've been working with the Perpetua team for about 4 years now in developing the restoration design, and our goal, as stated here, but more simply, is of course restoration, and that means making things better than they are today. Next slide, please. So why do we need to restore the stream? As Mackenzie mentioned, there are a number of historical impacts resulting in a baseline condition that includes about 13.3 kilometers of perennial streams that have been impacted, and that's shown in yellow on the left. In the middle here, we're showing the interim condition. So obviously there, as part of the proposed project, there would be an increase in mining. That would result in an increase in the disturbance area shown in blue, the overlap with the existing shown in green. There's been an effort, of course, to try to place proposed mine features on top of or overlapping with the historical mine features. So then the restoration component would be about 20 kilometers of stream that would be restored in and around those historical and or proposed mine areas. Next slide. So what does restoration mean? It means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, but in short, we think of restoration as what's depicted here on the right, where you're developing a naturally dynamic, deformable, resilient stream that mimics natural conditions. And while the project would be reclaimed, as most mine sites traditionally are, reclamation traditionally is focused on stability, and stream reclamation therefore is focused on developing stable conditions, not necessarily those that mimic natural conditions. And so our goal is to provide a true natural stream restoration approach, and that's what's depicted in these images here of the Yankee Fork of the Salmon River in an area that had been previously placer mined. And you can see how straight and lacking habitat. The image on the left is that is reclaimed, very stable, but that stream was later restored to the image on the right. That's a constructed stream channel with placed material, logs and riffles and pools and such to be much more naturally dynamic and mimic natural conditions. And that's our aim as well. Next. So what is the stream restoration process? How do we go about this? And in short, I've outlined on the left what we do for all of our projects. And first, we break the area out into different reaches, and then we go and look at reference sites in and around the area. Not to say that the reference sites are perfect, but they do provide valuable insight into what's occurring at other streams in the area that span a wide range of different characteristics, from steep and narrow to less steep and unconfined. And that reference site data can then be used to develop empirical formulae that can help fill in gaps between some of the data points. And we use published design guidelines, of which there are many. And those three things combined provide multiple lines of evidence for us to develop the physical design criteria for the project. So essentially making sure that the stream is going to function physically by transporting sediment and water and nutrients, and not excessively eroding its banks or bed or filling in with sediment. But of course, we have aquatic organisms as well. And so within the constraints of what's physically appropriate, we also then try to optimize the stream for biological conditions. So we've worked with a number of fisheries biologists to understand what the preferred habitat conditions are for various sensitive species and keystone species such as Chinook salmon, steelhead, bull trout, and cutthroat trout. And we've incorporated, to the extent that's geomorphically appropriate or feasible, into the physical design those biological criteria, and refined our design to best provide conditions that will improve habitat for those sensitive species and life stages. Next. I just wanted to show one example of one of our reference sites, and this is a really good example because, first of all, this is Reardon Creek. It's just one drainage to the southwest of the project site, and it has a unique condition associated with it, and that is a natural dam. There was a large landslide that blocked Reardon Creek during the time of the last ice age or thereabouts. And for the last 10,000 plus years, the area upstream of that dam has been slowly filling in with sediment. And there remains, of course, a lake, as you can see in the aerial image on the left. But what that did was gave us an area to evaluate some very low gradient environments with a steep gradient down the dam face of that landslide. And that's similar to what's proposed at the tailings facility for the Stibnite project, was a dam with a low gradient reach upstream and a steep gradient down the face. So we were able to collect some really valuable data both in the low gradient and steep gradient segments of this reference reach. Next. All right. One of the other key features to be restored, of course, is fish passage at the Yellow Pine Pit, as Mackenzie mentioned. This is an oblique aerial looking upstream, and you can see the east fork of the south fork of the Salmon, which commonly I'll just refer to this as the east fork, flowing toward us, and then down a cascade into the existing Yellow Pine Pit, and then on downstream. That barrier currently blocks about 35 miles or 56 kilometers of perennial stream upstream of that point. Now, there are different fish access attributes associated with that Eileen will touch on as the next presenter, but just wanted to point out how much perennial stream is blocked by that current barrier. Next. As part of the restoration effort, as part of the mining effort, Perpetua would divert the east fork around the Yellow Pine Pit as it's being mined. So here we are looking now in the downstream direction at the same location, and the yellow line depicts the approximate area of where a tunnel would be built into the mountainside, diverting flow around the Yellow Pine Pit. The gradient of that tunnel allows for fish passage, essentially a fishway or fish ladder, similar to what you'd see at a dam, that would provide volitional fish passage upstream and downstream during that period of time in which the Yellow Pine Pit is being mined. After it's done being mined, so approximately 10 years later, the Yellow Pine Pit would actually be backfilled and the stream restored back over the top with natural passage up and down, and the mine tunnel would be abandoned. Next slide. So what's upstream of Yellow Pine Pit? What are these fish going to gain access to? Essentially, there are areas that have been historically impacted that we're proposing to enhance. That's the yellow highlighted streams. There are areas that Perpetua is proposing to divert streams around proposed facilities, and then we would reestablish and restore those streams in those locations. That does include a barrier at the tailings facility, as I mentioned earlier, but that barrier is significantly upstream from the existing barrier and in a trunk stream rather than, I'm sorry, in a tributary rather than the trunk stream. Additionally, there's a large portion of the East Fork, as you can see on this map on the right-hand side, that's generally been unimpacted by historical mining, is proposed to not have any direct impacts from the Stibnite Gold Project. Next. That area of the Upper East Fork looks like this. There's a portion that had been burned in the past, and some of those trees are now starting to fall in and provide a lot of cover and structure for the channel, sorting gravels, creating pools, generally pretty good habitat. Likewise, you go upstream just a little bit further and you get into a spruce fir dominated forest with a number of floodplain wetlands. You have a nice sinuous channel with vertical to undercut banks, gravel bed, pools, large wood. Again, also generally pretty good habitat. So there's a combination of existing high quality habitat and proposed enhanced and restored habitat upstream of the existing yellow pine pit. So what does the restoration actually look like? I want to show you three examples highlighted on the right where I have my red writing there. The restoration of the East Fork over Yellow Pine Pit, Blowout Creek, and Meadow Creek. Okay. So when the Yellow Pine Pit is further mined, that will then be backfilled. And that's what's shown here in orange is the backfill of the Yellow Pine Pit, as you can see on the right. Additionally, we're going to create a new floodplain. You can see that floodplain's on the order of 200 to 500 feet wide or greater in some places, shown in green, and the East Fork restored through the middle of that. Now, the floodplain, we worked with the Stibnite mine plan team to create a sinuous floodplain, that S shape, rather than a straight line. If it were straight, the stream gradient would end up around 6.5%. By creating the sinuous floodplain, we can get a stream gradient on the order of 4.5%, which is a little easier for those fish to move upstream through. Likewise, those two curves in the floodplain coincide with Midnight Creek coming in from the right, that's shown as MNC, and Hennessy Creek coming in from the left, or HC. Those two streams are both perennial cold water streams, but they're relatively small and currently don't have any fish use or fish access. But by allowing those streams to flow down along the margin of the downstream margin of each of those bends in the floodplain, we can create what's called a wall-based channel, where flood flows from the East Fork, as depicted by those light blue dashed lines, would periodically add flow and volume to those small tributaries, scouring pools, moving sediment, and creating habitat. During the rest of the time, the cold perennial water from those small tributaries would fill that habitat, providing valuable off-channel rearing habitat for the sensitive life stages of those fish that I mentioned earlier, Chinook, steelhead, bull trout, cutthroat, for juvenile rearing. And that's an example of optimizing our physical design criteria to meet some of those biological needs. Okay, next. Another example is the Meadow Creek over the tailings facility. You can see there's a proposed dam that upstream of, or to the left of, would be tailings, and downstream a large development rock buttress to help stabilize that dam. And as I mentioned earlier with the reference site at Reardon Creek, you would have a very low gradient system on top of that facility with a steep drop off down the side. That would represent a barrier, but there would be isolated population of fish upstream and enhanced and restored habitat downstream. Now, unique to this site, as well as the restoration over Yellow Pine Pit, is that the stream and floodplain would be lined. So there would be an effort to separate the potential groundwater interchange from the stream groundwater and what lies below, in this case, the tailings facility. But the streamliner isn't just beneath the stream, it's buried at depth beneath the entire floodplain. So here we've got about a 12-foot wide stream and about 150 to 200-foot wide floodplain. So ample room for the stream to migrate around laterally and vertically, because as I mentioned, the streamliner would be buried below the maximum anticipated scour depth and across the full width of the floodplain. So as part of our natural channel design, the stream would be able to migrate and meander and scour pools and evolve just like a natural stream would. Additionally, we've provided, as you can see at the upstream extent, some accommodation space for alluvial fans to develop, which we would anticipate in that transition from a steep to low gradient area. Okay. And Blowout Creek, kind of in the middle of the project area, although there's not a lot of proposed impact associated with Blowout Creek and the Stibnite Gold Project, just a small amount right down at the mouth of the creek. Historically, there was a large impact associated with a hydroelectric dam that was built up at that meadow that you can see on the right-hand image. That dam failed in the late 50s and unleashed a lot of water that destabilized those slopes that's through a lateral glacial moraine. And that's been unstable ever since, and it's been contributing fine sediment every year to the East Fork, and is considered the single largest source of fine sediment to the whole system. Okay, next. The restoration approach then is to stabilize those slopes, recognizing that they really won't become stable until they reach the angle of repose. So we've calculated that and extrapolated that onto a newly designed stream bed that's shown in that pink line down below, basically making sure that there's accommodation space along the margins without interacting with the stream itself. And we'd accomplish that by essentially backfilling the channel with rock. And so that enables the stream to flow through a rock drain as in the low flow time period, keeping it shaded and physically separated from the sediment source. And over time, that would fill in and occupy the pre-built channel on top. And there's really not fish passage up this area right now. So fish passage is not a big concern. It's a relatively steep gradient area up to 17% gradient. So that's the fix for the sediment problem. And upstream, that destabilization has resulted in an incision and head cut that's dried out the meadow in this area. About 16 feet of incision have occurred. We're proposing a structure near the downstream end of that meadow that would provide grade control and function similar to a large beaver dam, backing water up into that area, allowing it to slowly fill again with sediment, but also reestablishing the groundwater levels that would provide the hydrology and for the wetland. Okay. So how are we going to evaluate our goal, our objective of trying to restore these streams to a condition better than what they are today? And we're doing that through a stream functional assessment. So the functional assessment that we've developed is based on the U.S. Forest Service watershed conditions indicators, which are listed here. And so each of these indicators has been evaluated at a number of sites throughout the project area to determine what the existing or baseline condition is. And then we estimate the future condition for each of these based on models, based on our stream design, based on proposed impacts from the project, and calculate what those would be for each of the reaches that are a part of the project for each year of the mine. Next. And we tabulate all of those data in this stream functional assessment following this simple equation. Essentially, all of those watershed condition indicator elements are tabulated and normalized as a percentage. So we have a percent functional index, the quality, and that's multiplied by the quantity. My 6-year-old. So then, Olive, I'm giving a presentation, honey. Bye. The length of the stream and the stream order is therefore provided as the quantity. So we have quality and quantity that are multiplied together to create what we call a functional unit. So those functional units are tabulated for each of the stream reaches, and all of those are then added together to provide the next slide. What you can see is the outcome. So we do this for every reach and every year of the proposed mine life. The years are along the bottom. The baseline condition is shown as the dashed line at 0 across the middle of the graph. All of the impacts are shown in red, accumulating a deficit, and all of the proposed restoration or mitigation efforts are shown in green. And the net difference is the blue line in the middle. So you can see there are a number of early impacts and early restoration efforts, including passage at Yellow Pine Pit, restoration of Blowout Creek, enhancements at the East Fork, but they don't fully overcome the impacts initially. Over time, more and more restoration efforts start to offset the impacts and ultimately result in a surplus, which is, our validation that the restoration effort is offsetting and resulting in a condition better than where we started. And all of that, of course, is to help provide habitat for fish, which is the next part of the presentation.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Mackenzie. My name is Eileen Llewellyn, and I'm here with Paul Leonard. We both work with Brown and Caldwell, an environmental consulting firm nationally across the country and locally in Boise. We've been working with Perpetua for several years now, related to several aspects of this project, including the fisheries component. Next slide. So the Stibnite Gold Project has 3 overarching goals for fisheries in the East Fork, Meadow Creek, and all of its fish-bearing tributaries within the mine footprint, which are listed here for restoration of volitional passage, which means providing passage upstream of the existing YPP cascade that is currently a barrier to fish, restoration of spawning and rearing habitat in both the East Fork and Meadow Creek, and to minimize effects on ESA listed fish, CHINOOK, bull trout, and steelhead within the project area. The intent is to provide restoration of the passage and provide a very long awaited permanent solution to the fish barrier that has existed for decades, as Mackenzie said earlier, and to provide access to miles of improved habitat that is not only a suitable habitat, but as well as designated critical habitat for both Chinook salmon and bull trout. So I want to just touch on 2 areas that are important to salmonid habitat: accessibility and temperature. These slides will hopefully tell you a story of how the Stibnite Gold Project affects these 2 important metrics for salmonid species. Next slide. So before I get into the stories, I just wanted to point out one very integral project component of the Stibnite Gold project, which is the East Fork tunnel around Yellow Pine Pit, as Rob was showing earlier. Roughly just short of a mile long tunnel that will provide access and volitional passage upstream to the East Fork above YPP and its tributaries. This is an integral component because it provides access for salmonid species earlier in the mining process, such that the passage is available for salmonid species rather than having to wait until the East Fork is restored over the backfilled YPP at approximately year 11. So in essence, Perpetua is able to give this access approximately 12 years sooner than waiting for the restoration over the backfilled YPP. Next slide. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is accessibility and how that relates to designated critical habitat for both Chinook salmon and bull trout. It's also beneficial to make the point that this is all applicable to steelhead as well. Critical habitat was not mapped above the YPP as designated critical habitat, but the habitat is suitable for steelhead. So this applies to all 3 of those species, as well as cutthroat trout as well. So currently, designated critical habitat upstream of the YPP is inaccessible. The fish species cannot go above the lake shown here in this picture. The DEIS did not take into account the change in the accessibility of this critical habitat above the YPP in the East Fork, Meadow Creek, and the other tributaries in the watersheds above the YPP. When the East Fork Tunnel Fishway is operational at what's called the end of year -1, designated critical habitat for both Chinook salmon and bull trout will become accessible to these species. And as I mentioned earlier, a second ago, similar improvements will occur for steelhead as well. Next slide. So we took the GIS data from the DEIS and mapped out the story to show how access to designated critical habitat changes from current conditions to a post-mining condition or the new permanent condition 22 years later. As you can see in this map, we've showed what is accessible designated critical habitat versus not accessible or inaccessible critical habitat under current conditions. As you can see in this map, the YPP Cascade Fish Barrier is there, and therefore the majority of total designated critical habitat in these watersheds is not accessible to these species. And if you go to the next slide, this is when the tunnel fishway is fully operational and provides access to these salmonid species. But there is also, Meadow Creek has been diverted around the TSF. And so there is a barrier in place during mining operations at this location during this mine year. But what you can see is that a large majority, or actually approximately 94% more designated critical habitat is accessible for Chinook salmon during mining operations because of the tunnel fishway being operational, providing that access. Then if you go to the next slide, what's considered post-mining condition, or after mining is completed, the accessible habitat changes again because the East Fork stream channel is restored over backfilled yellow pine pit. And but the existing high gradient barrier is still there at the DRSF and is a fish barrier at that point. But as Rob pointed out, this is not on the main trunk any longer of the East Fork, but a tributary to the main stem. The graph to the right, you can see that the dark blue is the accessible habitat over time, and that increases over the mine years and is again approximately 94% greater during post-mining condition, or the new normal, or the new permanent condition, compared to existing conditions today. And the next slide, the same story is very similar for bull trout critical habitat. Here you can see under current conditions, the YPP barrier again is preventing accessibility to designated critical habitat upstream of that barrier under current conditions. Once the mine becomes operational, as shown on the next slide, an increase again of accessible habitat occurs because of the tunnel fishway becoming operational, and but some of the designated critical habitat is still inaccessible because of the TSF upstream on Meadow Creek. Then in post-mining conditions, similar to designated critical habitat for Chinook, a more accessible habitat is the new normal for the new permanent conditions under post-mining conditions as compared to current conditions. That's because, again, East Fork is restored over the backfilled YPP, and then some is inaccessible because of the high gradient barrier at the DRSF. So the next thing I wanted to bring up is temperature. The DEIS analysis concluded that currently under all fish-bearing streams except for the East Fork above Meadow Creek, stream temperatures exceed bull trout weekly maximum temperature ratings of 13 degrees C, which is the same for salmonid spawning daily maximum temperatures, and salmonid spawning maximum daily average temperatures of 9 degrees Celsius. I think that's important to note that during the most warmest periods of the year for stream temperature in the summer and the fall, that current conditions exceed those standards as they exist now. The DEIS incorrectly states that the modeling of alternatives show lethal temperatures of 21 degrees Celsius at some locations. And this is unclear, if this is a daily or weekly threshold. The analysis concluded that there are no reaches in any mine year. Well, in fact, what really is the case is the DEIS analysis concluded that there are really no reaches in any mine year or under any alternative that have a simulated daily average temperature that exceeds the threshold for lethal temperatures, or 21 degrees Celsius. Even if a more conservative comparison is made to the summer constant, which is considered the midpoint between the daily average and the daily maximum, only Meadow Creek exceeds this threshold by 0.25 degrees Celsius, and only under alternative 1 for end of year 18. Split modeling was conducted during the hottest week of the summer, late July, and the hottest week of the fall, which is early September, to represent the most extreme periods to be able to analyze the potential effects of temperature from the various alternatives in the EIS. So some background here on the next slide on how this analysis was done that I think is important to note. The graph on the left that has the orange and the yellow dots, I mentioned earlier, maximum daily maximum or maximum daily average. So what does that really mean? If you take stream temperature data, example here at Meadow Creek at the East Fork confluence, and you take 7 days over the week we modeled, whether it was the maximum summer temperature period or the maximum fall temperature shown in the graph on the right, if you take those 7 days and you take the average of the maximum temperatures, which are the orange dots, you get the maximum daily maximum. If you take the average of the average dots, which are the yellow dots, that gives you the maximum daily average mean. So that's important because we modeled the warmest week in summer and the warmest week in fall as a conservative measure. All of these data were used from 2012 to 2019 to help calibrate the model as well. So in the next slide, it's worthy to point out that we modeled the worst 2 weeks throughout the year. It is always cooler. It will always be cooler stream temperatures than those 2 weeks, anytime in that year period, based on how we did the modeling. So it's important to note the context of the life stages of the various salmonid species in these streams as that relates to these 2 weekly conditions, as shown in this figure here for steelhead, cutthroat trout, summer Chinook, and bull trout, of the different life stage periodicities of when different points within their life stages throughout the year. So in the next slide, we took the data for no action or considered current condition and showed the modeled of that period against the MOD Pro, which is alternative 2, and showed at years 6, 18, and 52, and wanted to compare those data to different locations of fish-bearing stream locations that were modeled for stream temperature. As you can see, temperatures are elevated as a result of the MOD Pro in some locations and not in other locations. And that differential or the difference or that delta is less over time between mine years 6, 18, and 52. After reading the DIS and reviewing public comments, Perpetua knew that water temperatures deserved an additional attention and improvements. We are currently working with the state and federal agencies to refine the project and have identified potential modifications to reduce stream temperatures. These concepts include things such as planting of wider and taller riparian vegetation to provide shading and temperature reductions, and the addition of a widened, deepened portion of the East Fork, South Fork Salmon River. Next slide. This is similar to the summer maximum weekly summer condition. Much cooler stream temperatures overall, both for no action and the MOD Pro, which would be expected given that this is later in the year. But what's notable here is that temperatures are essentially the same, or in some cases less than current conditions across the 3 selected years shown here in these graphs. Again, this is not a clearly defined answer, as a lot of this depends on habitat and whatnot. And I'll just reiterate that these are the 2 hottest maximum weekly conditions over the year, and that the salmon species within these stream systems will not experience temperatures hotter over any other week across the year. So with that, I'll pass it on to Doug. Oh, I guess one more slide, sorry. So just as a summary, to point out again, the restoration of the volitional passage from the East Fork Tunnel Fishway is very important, as shown in the story, I hope, through the series of maps, that designated critical habitat and suitable habitat for all salmonid species is provided from the tunnel, and the restoration of spawning and rearing habitat, that it's not just the accessibility, but the goal of restoring and enhancing habitat, as Rob mentioned, for spawning and rearing habitat for these species in mind. and in the end, to minimize the effects on the ESA listed species.
All right, thanks very much, Eileen. Yeah, let's talk about water quality. Obviously, that has an effect on the resources that Rob and Eileen just talked about, but I'm going to be a little bit more chemical about it, if you will. One thing that's important to point out is that we know a lot about the water quality at this site. There's obviously been a bit of measurement here and there throughout the years. A lot of that was done by agencies or government entities that tend to do research, but since 2011, Perpetua has had in place a really comprehensive baseline monitoring program. And I'm not going to run through all the nitty-gritty details, but suffice it to say that there are hundreds and in some cases thousands of samples of both surface water and groundwater from a large number of sites that goes on for multiple years and includes many, many constituents, many metals, nutrients, organics, lots of things are being measured out there. So we know a whole lot about the existing water quality. And we know that the existing water quality is not necessarily great because of a lot of the history that, that McKinsey talked about. This is a photo from the 1940s, shows that there's been activity out there for quite some time, and there was a lot of earth moving, a lot of buildings constructed, a lot of storage of mining byproducts, mining waste products in ways that are not necessarily or even close to today's standards for those kinds of things. The graphic that you see on the right-hand side of the screen is pretty interesting because we've taken all of that data from all of the monitoring program samples and used a color gradient to depict the concentration of arsenic. Arsenic is one of 3 chemicals out there that tends to stand out as being above levels that we would like to see in our surface waters. And what you see here is that in areas that are dark purple or even the medium purple color, those have less arsenic. Whereas when you get into the orange sections of streams and the yellow sections of streams, those are much higher concentrations of arsenic. Many of those are related to the historic mining, but there's also a natural component that I'll talk about in a couple of minutes. But you can get the feeling here that there is quite a bit of variability from one stream to another, but there's also a kind of a general progression that as you move downstream through the site, things tend to get at higher concentrations. And that's something that, that we've been working with for several years. This is simply another historic photo, again, from the 40s. This shows the northern part or the downstream section of the site. And again, lots of activity, lots of earth moving back in those days. The graphic on the right-hand side is still the same graphic, but just shows that you've got a lot of factors historically contributing to today's water quality. And these are some more modern photos, but again, indicating the extent of the remnant materials. There's an area that is the spent ore disposal area, or the soda. The Hecla Mining Company left a heap leach pad in place. There are some other leach pads from prior mining. The photo on the right shows how one company, the Bradley Mining Company, left their mine tailings in a big pile, and then a subsequent effort put spent ore over the top of that. So you sort of have this this sandwich of one kind of mine waste that's overlain by a different kind of mine waste. And again, without a whole lot of concern about what happens when rain or snow falls on it and water runs through it or off of it. And that is part of what leads to today's water quality conditions. So overall, there's a lot of information on this slide. There won't be a quiz. The graphic on the lower left-hand corner shows, as you look from the left side to the right side, you're going from upstream to downstream, and the size of those colored circles is proportional to the concentration of the arsenic at those places. And here we're looking not at the concentration, I misspoke, we're looking at the loading. So in other words, the amount of arsenic that's moved downstream in pounds per year. And you can see that, that it is quite high numbers as you go from upstream to downstream, largely as a result of some of that historic mining. And then the graphic on the right-hand side actually shows a time series. Remember, we've been collecting samples on a monthly basis for a long time. The blue line that you see on that graphic is what the water flow looks like. So in other words, during a short period of each year, the flows get really high as the snow is melting. But during most of the year, the flows are relatively low because there's simply not a lot of rainfall up in that high valley area. And then the three other lines, the orange, the brown, and the green line, show you the three parameters of the highest concern. That's antimony, arsenic, and mercury. And you can see that they tend to wobble around a little bit over the course of this 4-year sampling period. But in general, what we see is that they stay at levels that are fairly elevated during the low flow periods, and then tend to go down during the high flow. That's because when the snow is melting, you have a lot more water relative to the metals, so the metals concentrations go down. On the flip side, however, the green line for mercury, what we generally see there is that mercury concentrations go up when there's more water, and that is attributed to the fact that the mercury is primarily carried in particulate form. So as you have more water that's cascading down the stream, it's carrying more particles with it, and those particles have more mercury in it. It's a different behavior between mercury and the antimony and arsenic that tend to simply seep from the groundwater. But again, the overall picture is that we have concentrations of these things at levels that are higher than state standards are, and that they tend to have a sort of a periodic or a seasonal pattern to them. I mentioned the natural background. It's really important to remember that the reason that there are water quality concerns over certain metals here is because the metals that are here are what made the mining happen here. If this was not a highly mineralized valley, there would not have been a need or a desire to go mine there. So this is not like we have put an industrial facility here to create some new chemical like PCBs or DDT. This is simply the residual of the materials that naturally occurred there. And Perpetua's scientists have done some study and shown that even if the historic mining had never happened, there would be segments of these streams, and in particular some springs and some seeps that occur naturally that would already be at elevated levels. So while we know that the historic mining and the residual legacy materials contribute to the elevated levels, we also know that some of it is a natural situation and that all of it is representing materials that have been there because of the way that the geology formations in the area have distributed them. So let's move to what Perpetua intends to do. It's pretty straightforward in terms of water management. The goal is to protect and improve surface water quality and groundwater quality. It's also to make sure that we do a smart job of providing the supply. Mining takes a lot of water, and we want to make sure that we are using water in a very smart way. And that includes reusing and recycling as much water as possible so that we're not getting water dirty and then having to treat it to release it. But if we use water and we get that water a little bit dirty, let's use it again and again and again so that we keep the water we've touched inside the mine operation system. And that way we only have to treat and release the water during times that there might be too much water in the overall water balance. And then finally, we want to minimize and mitigate any impacts to both stream flow on the quantity side and to the water quality, including the temperature side, as Eileen talked about for the fisheries. So a different way of looking at that is that our holistic approach to water management is we want to avoid as many impacts to water quality as we possibly can. And we do that by essentially keeping our clean water clean and then reusing our dirty water. We also want to minimize our impact as much as we can. If we have to touch water and use it in the process, then we want to make sure that we're not using more water than we need. That's where this recycling and reusing mindset comes in. And then finally, as I mentioned before, we mitigate by making sure that we are treating water when we have to treat water. We're going to hold water in storage ponds to keep from releasing it. We're going to manage water by moving it around from one place to another to make sure that we use the water for its highest and best use in as many cases as we possibly can. And then the little cloud over at the right-hand side reminds us that adaptive management is key to any operation like this. And adaptive management means that when something in the future changes, maybe climate change, it may be that simply a very wet year comes along, it may be that something changes the schedule of the mine, but our response to that is not to keep doing what we were doing, but we constantly reassess where we are and we adapt to those new conditions to make sure we're still making smart choices for the environment. So in terms of specific water management activities during construction, there will be a very serious effort to diverting water around the future mine facilities so that we, again, keep that clean water clean. We'll also begin doing the early restoration and mitigation that Rob talked about. And there will be some removal and reprocessing of some of those legacy materials. So some of those piles that I showed you photos of will actually be picked up, moved, put into places where they can be better contained, or in some cases, actually run through the mine processing facility so that we can extract more of the minerals that were there before, because our technology today is more efficient and we can take out more of those minerals for beneficial uses. During the operations period, this is when the mine is actually generating the metals that it's after. We maintain those clean water diversions. We do some dewatering to make sure that we can get equipment and people into the mine pits. That dewatering water is pulled from wells around the mine pits, and it's actually used in the process. It's a very important part of the water supply. And then MIW stands for mine impacted water. We manage and treat the water that we touch to make sure that it's used as much as possible within the process loop, as opposed to having to require treatment and release. And then finally, during reclamation and closure, we continue to manage that mine impacted water for as long as there are exposed mine surfaces out there. The tailings storage facility is a major feature. That's where all of the leftover rock pieces go, very fine material goes into the TSF. And so it has a lot of entrained water in it. We manage that water very carefully. Some of that can be evaporated where it goes out as clean water. Other water will likely require some treatment and then discharge. But the idea is to dry that TSF out to the point where we can put the stream across the top of it, as Rob talked about, with that liner under it, reestablish the connection of MEADOW Creek from the upper reaches to the East Fork of the South Fork and all the tributaries. And then finally, after all of the pieces are in place and the hydrology is reestablished, we complete that reclamation and restoration process to get the ecological components of the site back into place. So here's a couple of graphics on the water management plan. This simply shows in those light blue lines. The light blue lines are the extent of the diversions, and you can see that there will actually be miles of channels created simply to carry water around the outsides of the mine facilities so that we don't get clean rainwater or clean runoff into the mine facilities where it could pick up contaminants. We keep the clean water clean, minimize the amount of water that we touch, and do a lot of very, very specific water diversion as part of that. And the next graphic is simply a view to the south. Again, this is where the tailing storage facility is. You can see again several miles of diversions of clean water around the facility. You can see some ponds on there. The blue polygons are contact water ponds. That's the mine impacted water, and the water is collected in those locations to make sure that we can manage it and get it clean if we have to discharge it, but more than likely we just hold it until the mine can use it in its process. Remember that there are very distinct regulatory mechanisms that we have in place. So this isn't a self-reporting or honor system kind of a thing. There are actually permits and approvals that will be issued. There will be an IPDES permit issued by the state of Idaho. It'll have very specific permit limits. It'll have monitoring requirements, and it will have ramifications if there are problems that require attention to any issues. So that's a very key part of the regulatory piece. Idaho also will do what's called a groundwater point of compliance. They determine locations on the site where groundwater is expected to meet particular conditions. So between those two different approvals, you have protection of surface water and protection of groundwater that are essentially documents that are in place and overseen on a continuous basis by the state of Idaho to make sure that, that we're doing what we intend to do. And then water treatment is a key piece here. I'm not going to go into much detail because we're running short on time, but suffice it to say that our team has looked at a series of different technologies to pick the ones that seem to have the best track record for settings like this. We're not reinventing the wheel. We know what has worked in other locations and what hasn't. And so we are designing our system to be a reliable system that includes both storage, management, moving, pumping of water, but also an active treatment system during construction and operations to make sure that if we have to discharge water, it's going to meet the permit limits that are established for the site. The target constituents, I won't go through it in detail, but again, arsenic, antimony, and mercury, we're treating primarily to remove those. When we do that, the treatment process also will remove other metals. So we're actually being overly conservative because we treat for the big three, as I might say, but we also will take out other metals that might be of concern. So that way we kind of get an across the board treatment of the metals. And then, as I mentioned, several different assessment technologies have been used here to decide what the best approach is. Suffice it to say that there will be more than one kind of treatment through the life of the mine. Iron co-precipitation will probably be used the most heavily, at least through construction operations, but other things like evaporation or like biochemical reactor wetlands are also certainly on the table because they can play a role in making sure we get that water clean again. And then one thing that's very important is to note that Perpetua has already signed a voluntary agreement that's called an Administrative Settlement Agreement and Order on Consent, or an ASAOC, and that was signed with EPA and other agents were co-signatories as well. That has caused Perpetua to already begin the process of actions, real actions, to address some of the legacy materials. And this is important because it means that before mining ever begins, there will be some actions that will be completed. And even if mining never happened, some actions would still be completed. After mining begins, there may be other actions, but this is another important facet to show the commitment of Perpetua to making sure that the cleanup is really happening. They're starting the cleanup before they even start earth moving for mining. So in terms of the water quality summary overall, there are legacy activities and natural mineralization that has caused problems. There's no doubt about that. Perpetua intends to go in there and do things that will help to clean up and remove some of those legacy issues. The ASAOC is an upfront effort along those lines, and then the mine plan includes removal and reprocessing of large amounts of additional legacy materials. And then the water management and treatment steps that I talked about ensure that the water that is touched during mining is handled appropriately, managed well, reused, reprocessed, recycled. And if we have to release water, the water will be treated to make sure that we adhere to Idaho's water quality criteria and keep that overall surface water resource clean and improve it from the way it looks today.
Well, thanks everybody. Since we are about at the hour, I'll just go very quickly through some of the process of where we are today. So as I mentioned in the beginning, the draft environmental impact statement has been published by the Forest Service, and we in the public have now had the opportunity to review those findings and submit suggestions and opportunities to help refine the project. The Forest Service is now looking through those comments and identifying what improvements can be made between the draft EIS and the final EIS that we anticipate later this year. So, I think the most important conclusions for us is that we've designed from the very beginning that this project can be the resource and the solution that Stibnite needs to improve water quality, to help fish once again access miles of habitat that they are currently blocked from today, and to overall see conditions improve at Stibnite. And as we go through the process, through the NEPA process, we are listening and taking feedback very seriously and identifying even more solutions that can be brought to the table to ensure that the project, once again, is the best project for Idaho. So with that, I would give you a gentle reminder that we're trying to do these webinars over once a month or so. You can go visit past webinars on our website, and then you can sign up for any of the ones we've got up in the future. But if there are questions or topics that you want to hear more about, please don't hesitate to reach out to our team and let us know what interests you and what you'd like to hear more about from us and the technical experts that we've brought on to the team here at Perpetua. With that, again, I will thank you. And Shelley, if we have a moment or two, let's open it up for questions.
Great, thank you so much, Mackenzie. We have one that did come in. So I was wondering, with the multi-year life cycle of salmon and time spent in the ocean, would it be possible for somebody to introduce salmon into the upper East Fork or the South Fork of the Salmon River and Meadow Creek before or during construction so that they can begin returning home to spawn when the tunnel is finally complete?
Paul, do you want to take that question?
Yeah, sure. Well, in fact, that's actually happening right now. The way that's happening now is that when there is available brood stock for Chinook salmon, brood stock are the salmon that they capture returning from the ocean, some of which were supported by hatchery production. They get those fish coming back in and they take the eggs and put them in a hatchery and raise them for release. And some of those, when they are available, the Idaho Fish and Game and the tribes bring those fish up and actually truck them upstream past the barrier and will stock them in Meadow Creek where they spawn, and that does produce young juvenile Chinook salmon, which we have as part of the studies done by Stibnite, by Perpetua. We've actually looked at and found young Chinook salmon coming out of that. The problem is that's a highly managed situation. The National Marine Fisheries Service, or NOAA Fisheries, depending on which agency name you use, actually documented those fish. We tagged those fish and took them all the way and monitored their progress all the way down to the mouth of the Columbia River. So that is actually happening right now, but it's a highly managed situation, and it's considered to be what's called a hatchery support population. Now, once volitional passage is established in the Fishway Tunnel, and later on through the restoration of the channel over the Yellow Pine Pit, in perpetuity, those fish will be able to migrate upstream, and that will move that population to what's called natural reproduction, which is a benefit to the species.
And what I love about that the most, Paul, is that there are fish today who are imprinted into these headwaters that they can't reach, but they are programmed to get back, and they want to get back. All they need is the means, right? So whether that's the tunnel or a reconstructed river, they're going to get there because that's what their instincts are driving them at. They just need support. And I think it's really exciting opportunity because of that program that has continued to imprint that desire to get back to where they belong.
Yeah, it's a bunch of fish with an instinct to get back to their natal streams, and that's what we're counting on.
Precisely.
Well, sticking with fish, what does the maximum stream temperature mean to fish mortality, Paul?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that? I didn't see the question.
Sure, no problem. What does maximum stream temperature mean to fish mortality?
Well, in streams in this part of the world and everywhere, their temperatures go up and down during the day and night, what's called diurnal variation. And during the maximum warmest part of the day, the temperatures can, in natural conditions and in modified conditions, can become what you would call stressful to fish. and cause them, at least temporarily during the day or for longer periods, cause them stress that might reduce their growth or reproductive success. But you have to consider the mean temperature during the day and the maximum temperature during the day. And those considerations were done by EPA and Idaho and the state of Idaho. And there were, of course, a lot of scientific considerations around making those, but that's how they established those thresholds: maximum daily average temperature and maximum weekly temperatures. And they sort of put a protective, a bit of a protective margin on those. And that's how they developed those in consideration of those various effects, both maximum, daily average temperatures and maximum temperatures. Maximum temperatures rarely become high enough during normal daily variation, et cetera, to result in fish mortality. It's usually just stress, and fish have a lot of adaptive mechanisms for those kinds of things. That when it gets hot during the day, people that angle know that fish don't bite during the hottest part of the day typically, and they're usually sitting in the bottom of pools and sort of behaviorally avoiding those temperatures, and then they're more active during the cooler parts of the day, et cetera. So it's a very dynamic relationship, but I hope that answered the question.
Thank you, Paul. I appreciate it. Somebody wanted to know, in the draft EIS, it has RIBs included in the plan. Are those, and that means rapid infiltration basins, are those needed with the project improvements that Perpetua has made?
No, they are the issues that the rapid infiltration, the challenges that the rapid infiltration basins were there to address have been further addressed and are no longer needed in the Mod Pro, the Mod Pro 2 alternative. That is the revised Mod Pro.
Okay, great. And I think this last question is probably a good one to end on, Mackenzie. What happens if alternative 5, which is the no action alternative in the draft EIS, is selected? And will the site get the much needed proposed solutions, or will it just stay as is?
That's a great question to end on. You're right. So alternative 5, as Shelley stated, is the alternative within the draft environmental impact statement that chooses no action. The Stibnite Gold Project would not move forward. So what would be left? Well, the East Fork of the South Fork of the Salmon River would still flow into an abandoned mining pit. We would still have millions of tons of unlined tailings degrading water quality, and we would still have salmon, Chinook, and bull trout blocked from accessing many miles of critical habitat. And our nation wouldn't have a supply of antimony, a critically designated mineral that we need for national defense and security and for our green energy future. So there's a big upside to doing something at Stibnite, and we've brought those solutions forward. I will mention, however, that should the project not go forward, we are still very much committed to the next 4 years of work under that agreement that Doug mentioned earlier with EPA. So over the next 4 years, we will be doing some work to reroute clean water to keep it clean and to move some tailings away from the river where they're causing a problem. So some action will be done, but we will not see the overall comprehensive cleanup that is proposed, both through combining the Stibnite Gold Project and the opportunities that are presenting themselves with a further phase of the ASAOC agreement. And that's about it. So I just want to thank everyone again. I know this was a long, technically heavy presentation. We do find that this information is valuable to get out there. So thank you for your time. It will be posted up on our website in case you want to go revisit any of the information. And again, if you have more questions, reach out to us. We're happy, Shelley and I, to help answer your questions or to put you in touch with any of our experts. So Enjoy your afternoon, and thanks everyone for your time and your interest.